Karl Marx was born on the 5th of May in 1818 in Trier, Germany. He was the son of a successful Jewish lawyer and became a lawyer himself in his younger years. He studied at one of the top universities in Germany, and at university, he would become introduced to the ideas of two other men that would shape much of what he would do later in life. Armed with his newfound knowledge, Marx would start to form many of his own ideas on humanity and economics. Marx's work to understand what drives the human condition made him the father of several different fields of study, but his work also makes him the father of modern cultural theory. Marx fully recognized that the masses will follow anything with mass appeal, the driving principle behind popular culture.
Welcome to The Glorious Beard, where today we are having a look at beards that have shaped culture. First up, we've got Robert Kirkman. You may know him as the man behind The Walking Dead, but his real story is equally as compelling as anything that he ever did in his comics. He didn't only create a zombie empire, he changed the way that independent comics could compete with the big guys, and he pulled it off with quite the glorious beard.
A man with ambition that far exceeds his current position in life clocks in once again to his job at a comic book store in Kentucky in the early 2000s. Customers come and go throughout the day picking out the latest issue of Spider-Man, Justice League, and other popular superhero comics of the era. The man at the register watches the clock with impatience, praying the time it takes from then to closing goes by faster than any other day he'd worked there before. The time finally comes. He clocks out and leaves knowing that this will be the last time he steps through those doors as an employee. The man's name is Robert Kirkman, and he just quit his job and is about to go $40,000 in debt, with nothing but a dream of being a comic book writer. Robert Kirkman's aspirations began during middle school in Cynthiana, Kentucky. He loved reading comic books, and also found a friend at the time named Tony Moore, who shared his love of comics and superheroes. The two of them grew up with the same dream of being artists on some of the most popular comic book characters of their time. After graduation, Eric Moore went to art school. Kirkman didn't. He was never all that good at drawing like Eric was. So instead, he took an open position at his local comic book store. Years go by, but he never lost that dream inside him to create comics. He wasn't cut out to be an artist, sure, but that didn't mean he couldn't write his own comic book. He decided to write his first comic called Battle Pope, and after sending it to publishers, he was met with nothing but rejection letters. He then proceeds to create his own publishing company called Funkotron, using his own personal funds, and pushed out 13 issues of Battle Pope during the years of 2000 and 2002. This was great. However, it took a pretty big toll on him, personally. He'd quit his job to work full-time on creating comics, and had racked up over $40,000 in debt just to keep his company afloat. Something needed to change for Robert, and quickly.
Yeah, my father was a small business owner. And so I did not feel comfortable going to him and being like, so I've thrown caution to the wind. I've quit my day job and I'm making these dumb comic books.
They're not dumb.
And I hope that it will at some point. Battle Pope was a stupid comic book, and I'm very proud of how stupid it was. So don't argue with me there. But you go to your parents and be like, a new book called Battle Pope. They're going to be like, oh, cool. No, that's going to go over poorly.
Fast forward to a pivotal moment in Kirkman's career. He was able to host an interview with one of his idols at the time, and partner of Image Comics, Erik Larsen. Through this opportunity, he was able to leave an impression on Larsen, and was given a phone number to reach out to him in the future. He took advantage of this, speaking regularly with Larsen and eventually pitching a series called Science Dog, which was again rejected. However, something must have stuck out to Larsen, because he offered him a position at Image Comics working on a smaller series that they were working on at the time. It wasn't long before he was getting other offers from some of the industry big names like Marvel that he would join with resounding excitement. He was finally getting paid to work in the comics industry, and began creating loads of comics and superheroes of his own for the company.
I don't know. Like, it wasn't until I started getting paid by Marvel that I was actually gainfully employed. Like, I was struggling up until that point. I mean, I did He-Man comics with Val Staples, and
I remember.
that kept me afloat for a while.
That's
And then
okay.
Rob Liefeld actually hired me to do a number of comics. Some of them weren't actually published, and that kept me afloat for a while.
Now, Kirkman desperately wanted to work on something big with his childhood friend, Tony Moore. This finally came to fruition with the creation of a comic book series I'm sure most people have heard of, The Walking Dead. Moore did the artwork, Kirkman did the writing. Sounds like a perfect ending for these friends destined for success? Not really. The two longtime friends found the relationship stressed by creative and philosophical differences. Moore wanted to take his time on the artwork to create the best comic he could each issue. Kirkman wanted to push out a new issue every month to keep fans engaged and the story moving at a good pace. The first 6 issues took an entire year to complete. Eventually, Moore left the project, signing his rights to The Walking Dead over to Kirkman, and possibly ending the dreams and once great friendship that the two of them shared. Now he could hire artists who were able to work with his demanding schedule, and soon, a new opportunity would arise that would take his career to heights he never imagined he would reach. A man named Frank Darabont purchases an issue of The Walking Dead and decides he wants to reach out to Kirkman about creating a TV series revolving around his comics. Darabont was a well-known director of some notable horror films at the time, like A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Blob remake, and also a small film at the time called The Shawshank Redemption. Over the next few years, Kirkman and Darabont worked together and had the show picked up by AMC. Afraid that the show wouldn't be true to his vision, he managed to get his way onto the writer's floor, ensuring that he still had control over the direction the show would take. He was no stranger to disagreements with others over his vision, and unfortunately, Darabont would soon leave the project because of it. In the end, Kirkman's vision stood true, and he created the highest rated cable TV show of all time. The success of The Walking Dead also allowed him to bring to life an old passion project that would shock the industry with a brand new take on what a superhero show can be, with his 2001 comic, Invincible.
It happens from time to time. I think that we're probably experiencing a lull, and the second, things come roaring back with a Deadpool Wolverine or James Gunn Superman movie. I think there's a lot of things on the horizon that will just kind of capture the hearts and minds of the public again, and we'll be back to where we were.
The show Invincible was picked up by Amazon Prime in 2021 and was immediately met with success from fans of his older comics and a massive amount of new fans that were perhaps a bit tired of the current standing of Marvel and DC superheroes on the big screen. Invincible has a new take on the superhero genre that is both refreshing and entertaining regardless of if you are a comic book lover or not. It's just good TV. Season 3 was recently released, and we here at The Glorious Beard want to highlight the series' creator, Robert Kirkman, who was able to follow his passion, going from massive debt at 21 years old to what is now a vast fortune with his estimated net worth at over $60 million. Along with a brilliant mind when it comes to writing comics and TV shows, Kirkman also has a pretty iconic beard himself. He's not afraid to let his facial hair shine on the stage, keeping it full and sometimes a bit untamed and wild. He's got a beard that perfectly encapsulates his attitude and uniqueness in today's entertainment industry. If you haven't already, be sure to check out some of his comics and catch up with his most recent TV project, Invincible, streaming on Amazon Prime today.
Thank you for listening to The Glorious Beard today. If you would like to let us know how we're doing, you can email us at thegloriousbeardpod@gmail.com. Beards have been making statements for as long as anyone can remember. Really, as long as people have had faces. And all throughout history, they've symbolized everything from power to rebellion, only to fall out of favor and then come roaring back again and again. In ancient times, they were a big deal. The Egyptians saw them as being divine, and even the pharaohs wore fake golden beards. The Greeks associated them with wisdom, like Socrates, and the Vikings, well, they just kind of made them look pretty badass. But then the Romans came along and they made shaving the standard, and a clean-shaven society meant that you were civilized because beards were seen as a little too wild. Then we get to the Middle Ages where beards were back in full force. Knights and kings grew them out to show strength and masculinity, and by the Victorian era, they had kind of hit their peak. They were thick, they were groomed, and they symbolized authority and wisdom. But then the 20th century arrived, and suddenly beards were out, especially within the corporate world, where the clean-shaven look ruled. That is until the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s. Beards became a symbol of rebellion and free thinking. The 80s came along, and suddenly everyone was clean-shaven, corporate, and playing it safe. But facial hair wouldn't stay down for long. So that leaves the question, what happened? Why did beards disappear? What affected them? And how did they make a comeback? Beards. They're so normalized and acceptable today that you can't go anywhere, whether it's your workplace or just the coffee shop down the street, without seeing a person sporting a beard or a mustache. However, just 40 to 50 years ago, having a beard in the professional workplace was seen in a different light. During the 1980s and 90s, it was seen as undesirable, even unprofessional. So why were beards so unpopular at this time in the workforce?
Television at prime times, advertising is not concerned about poverty, not concerned about race oppression, not concerned about the police, but the biggest problem is your hair groomed, and what's it like under your arms, and do you have bad breath? And this is the American obsession. And so I think that a generation of kids which says we don't care about your concepts of cleanliness is a revolutionary generation.
The countercultural movement brought new fashion styles and trends with it, including increasing popularity of beards. Role models of the 60s included celebrities like the Beatles, who began to grow out their beards as a result of the movement. To the activists in the 60s, the Beatles were not just a band, they were a cultural icon. Through their experiments, both in their presentation and fashion style, and through the musical choices, they were seen as different and therefore fit in with the lifestyle of rebellion that was desired in the 60s. The counterculture movement sought to highlight originality while encouraging people to find their true self, leading many to experiment with beards and personal grooming as a sign of self-identity and rebellion. As a result, many of the rising artists who came out of the movement, such as Allen Ginsberg, grew distinctive beards. Ginsberg rose to popularity in the 60s as a result of his unconventional poetry and his activism in the countercultural movement. His epic poem, Howl, in particular, was shared in many social gatherings, and he became a recognizable leader of the movement. His poetry is well recognized even today for its influential work on free verse and for the cultural movement it represents.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix.
So then, how did beards go from widely accepted in the 60s to being considered unprofessional in only 10 years' time? It would be the result of the countercultural movement backlash, which was caused by the political climate and leaders like Ronald Reagan, who brought back the standard of old ideals and norms to the average American.
My fellow Americans, on Monday, America will celebrate her 207th birthday. I love the 4th of July. I enjoy picnics and fireworks and long summer days. And I get excited with the thought that millions of our people all across our great country will, on this 4th of July weekend, join together in thinking about freedom and the men and women who sacrificed to make it our inheritance.
In opposition to the movement of new ideas presented through the counterculture movement, many of the average working-class Americans preferred to stay close with the ideals that they had been raised to believe centered around respectability. Leaders like Reagan encouraged such a lifestyle, leading many in the workplace to prioritize workplace professionalism and to appear polished and formal, choosing a more clean-shaven look than the beards that many leaders of the counterculture movement had.
They must be made to understand we will never compromise our principles and standards. We will never give away our freedom. We will never abandon our belief in God.
Beard trends through the counterculture movement and its backlash show how important role models and celebrities affect style trends, including beards. This trend continues today, where as a result of events like beard competitions and tools like social media, which opens up new styles and ideas, we're able to openly express identity in many ways, including through beards and facial hair. So the next time that you're out getting that latte or going in for another day of work, look around and appreciate all the different beards, styles, and trends. Which one is your favorite? And what does a person's beard say about them? As the counterculture movement showed, having a beard is not just a fashion statement, it's a lifestyle. Thanks for listening to The Glorious Beard. As we move on in this episode, it's important to preface this next segment, because the name that I'm about to mention has a lot of stigma behind it, but not exactly for the proper reasons. And once you learn the true story about the man and what he was really about and what he believed in, it may end up changing your mind. Karl Marx is a name that still sparks debate more than a century after his death. Some consider him to be a genius, some consider him a radical, and some say that he had quite the serious beard. We're going to cut through the myths today and dig into what Karl Marx actually believed and why people still can't stop arguing about him.
Very few people have had the immense impact on history that Karl Marx has had. Now, you may stop me here because you think of Karl Marx only as the inventor of communism. But what if I told you that Karl Marx didn't really invent communism as we know it today, and he was actually the father of modern economics and cultural theory? Karl Marx was a complicated man with a complicated history, and one glorious beard. Karl Heinrich Marx was born on the 5th of May in 1818 in Trier, Germany. He was the son of a successful Jewish lawyer and became a lawyer himself in his younger years. He studied at one of the top universities in Germany, and at university he would become introduced to the ideas of two other men that would shape much of what he would do later in life: Hegel and Feuerbach, philosophers that would shape Marx's thinking. Armed with his newfound knowledge, Marx would start to form many of his own ideas on humanity and economics. Following his time at university, he would be introduced to a lifelong friend and writing partner, Friedrich Engels. Engels and Marx met in Cologne, Germany in November of 1842, but would not become friends on first meeting. In fact, it was nearly 2 full years later when they would meet again in Paris in August of 1844. It was at this meeting that they would form their partnership. Marx believed that the capitalist ideas that governed society were deeply flawed and desired a new, alternative system. Here would come the birth of an idea known as communism.
What's that you're reading?
Karl Marx?
Surely you're not a communist. Do I have to be a communist to read Karl Marx?
Rupert, that's a valid answer. Well, if you're not a communist, what are you?
Nothing.
Nothing?
I dislike all forms of government.
But somebody must rule.
And I don't like the word rule.
Well, if we don't like the word rule, let's call it leadership.
Leadership in government is political power, and political power is an official form of antagonizing the people.
What magazine did you say he edits?
A commentary on current events.
But Marx and Engels did not really know what communism would look like. They certainly didn't think it would resemble what we think of it as today, and perhaps more to the point, they simply wanted a society where people worked for the good of each other instead of the good of themselves. A crazy idea, right? But that's what communism was to Marx. It was not what we think of it as today.
Marxism was associated with the Soviet Union and Maoist China and other so-called communist systems. But, Marx would have turned over in his grave to see what they were doing. They were radically anti-Marxist, radically. But as long, like take, say, the way the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, decided they had to drive the backward peasantry to industrialization by force in order to lead ultimately to a socialist society. I mean, the last 20 or 30 years of his life, Marx was working on peasant society in Russia, and Marx was just poring over the data, and he became convinced that there's real revolutionary potential in peasant society, peasant communes, peasant cooperative tradition, and so on. The urban socialists, both the Bolsheviks and the Social Democrats, literally suppressed all that work. It was just too inconsistent with their own class interests of controlling social movements. So that was gone. And the same is true across the board. I mean, I'm not, again, kind of like Adam Smith, you can't worship Marx, but he had things to say. And what he had to say, what he believed, was utterly inconsistent with what are called the communist socialist movements.
Marx's work to understand what drives the human condition made him the father of several different fields of study. He worked on understanding economics in a way that made sense, but his work also makes him the father of modern cultural theory. Marx fully recognized that the masses will follow anything with mass appeal, the driving principle behind popular culture.
When I was young, there were two heads who helped me structure my mind. Baldwin, which I read when I was 18, and Marx, on which I started working at university in academic surrounding, and I did 4 years on the Capitol. And in turn, I was an economist, so it was the central point of all my studies, and it told me a lot about this particular society, how it functioned, a society that have profit at its center. Any decision in the industry or elsewhere, in the news, elsewhere, is based on profit, which is the worst way to take decision. When you know what Marx did is to analyze the way that economy functioned, and he demonstrated how you are bound to go to crisis after crisis. It's the best way to understand what is happening today in a world where it's more and more difficult for young people to understand this machine.
And now that we've discussed the hard stuff, let's turn our focus to Marx's beard, because it was a sight to behold. Marx's beard, photographed many times in his life, was long, extending several inches from his face, white, and generally well-groomed. He was a man of culture, and the beard mirrored that. He was also wise, often able to predict trends in culture and economics generations before they happened. His beard was a perfect reflection of who he was and his incredible impact on future generations. Karl Marx was a man of wisdom and honor. He died on March 14, 1883, so we honor him today. His importance to history is beyond comparison, and he was a man of the people, by the people, and for the people. He was the father of modern economics, modern cultural theory, and the father of a truly glorious beard.
Thanks for joining us today on the Glorious Beard Podcast. Be sure to tell a friend about us and spread the word. And remember, you can find old episodes, which are equally as good as the one you just heard, on every major streaming podcast platform. Our production director at JXB Media is Bob McCoy. Our executive producer is Joseph Kay. Our associate producer is Damian Miller. Our fantastic writers for this episode were Joseph Kay, Kara Reeder, and TJ Grau. Major recognition needs to go to Brielle Tiger, who's working behind the scenes, turning all of our audio into visual excellence. You can see some of that on our YouTube channel by searching The Glorious Beard. And of course, our great social media team, made up of some of the most talented individuals that I have ever personally known. You can see their great work by going on Instagram and searching The Glorious Beard. The people who made this episode sound really awesome in the editing room were Brielle Tiger, TJ Grau, Christina De La Torre, and Bob McCoy. The smooth voice talents that you enjoyed in your ears came courtesy of TJ Grau, Bob McCoy, and Will Hoskins. The Glorious Beard is a production of JXB Media, a subsidiary of Top Secret Television Productions. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, follow, and whatever other fun stuff that your podcast platform provides in order to help us out. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.